In the wake of a catastrophic train derailment, Jason Carter, a former star quarterback turned security guard, emerges as the sole survivor. Confronted by survivor's guilt, Carter is compelled to unravel the mysterious circumstances surrounding the tragic accident. As he plunges into a self-guided investigation, he stumbles upon an unsettling truth. He is indestructible. Over the next few days, Jason could think of nothing but the inexplicable train wreck he had survived without a scratch. The horrific images of overturned cars, screaming passengers, and lifeless bodies haunted his dreams at night. But in the light of day, his miraculous invulnerability gnawed at him even more. Jason knew he should feel grateful to be alive, but questions swirled endlessly through his mind. How had he alone emerged from catastrophic destruction completely unharmed? What did it mean that he was seemingly unbreakable? And why did it feel like this was only the beginning? Unable to make sense of it all, Jason decided to launch his own private investigation into the derailment. Maybe if he could uncover what caused the crash, it would shed some light on his baffling survival. After work one evening, Jason drove to the train depot and slipped unnoticed into the rail yard. Police tape still cordoned off the wreckage, which had been hauled away from the tracks and piled in a scrap heap. Jason's heart clenched at the sight of the twisted, fire-gutted cars. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out a small flashlight and got to work searching for clues. Peering into the wreckage, Jason saw personal belongings and debris strewn about. A torn book, a child's shoe, a bloody shirt. He forced down a wave of nausea and continued digging. Finally, under a crushed seat, he spotted something promising. The train's mangled data recorder. Back home, Jason carefully pried open the recorder's cracked casing to reveal the intact data chip inside. He slid it into his computer and impatiently waited as files loaded. Soon enough, facts and figures from the train's instruments began populating his screen. Scrolling through the data, Jason saw that everything appeared normal in the minutes leading up to the crash. Speed, braking, and track switching all looked perfectly fine. Nothing to explain veering violently off the rails. But just as the wreck occurred, the data cut off. Jason slammed his fist on the desk in frustration. Another dead end. Dejected, he grabbed his jacket to head out for some air, but slipping his hand into the pocket, he felt something strange. Jason pulled out a small, metallic chip, similar to the recorder's data chip, but significantly more advanced. Peculiar symbols and circuits covered its surface. Jason rolled the mysterious chip between his fingers, puzzled over where it could have come from. Had it fallen into his pocket during the crash? Its complex design looked far beyond anything he'd seen before. On a hunch, Jason inserted the chip into his computer. Suddenly, his monitor flickered wildly and pages of data began rapidly populating the screen, seemingly reports on metallurgy, engineering, and material stress testing. Scanning through, Jason realized with a start that it contained detailed analyses of the train tracks and cars. Stress points, metal fatigue, safety flaws. Whoever wrote the reports clearly predicted the wreck long before it happened. "My God," Jason murmured. "Someone knew the derailment would happen. This was no accident." He pored over the data through the night, obsessed with unraveling the truth. By sunrise, the picture had become clear. The train company itself produced the reports. They knew for years that track defects and aging cars made the 9:15 commute prone to catastrophe. Yet they did nothing, ignoring the deadliness of dollar signs outweighing safety measures. Anger and frustration boiled up in Jason as the revelation crystallized. Corporate greed and negligence had caused the wreck, and the train company orchestrated a cover-up. They sacrificed innocent lives to protect their bottom line. Jason clenched the chip, feeling the weight of being the sole bearer of the truth. But clarity was also dawning on him now. His inexplicable survival was no coincidence. "I was spared because I'm the only one who can expose what truly happened," Jason said with conviction. "I am unbreakable because I'm meant to break this case wide open." For the first time since the crash, Jason felt a sense of purpose surging within. If he had been gifted this invulnerability, he would not waste it idly wondering why. He would use it to pursue justice and protect others from the deadly secrets and lies buried behind the wreckage. The course ahead was clear. The unveiling had begun. In the weeks after the train crash, Jason became obsessed with honing his newfound invulnerability into a force for justice. He pushed his unbreakable body to its limits, testing its boundaries through training and trials. At a hidden gym, Jason worked to increase his strength, speed, and agility far beyond normal human capabilities. He started small, crumpling metal, smashing concrete, lifting impossible weights. But soon he was flipping cars, crushing steel girders, running 50 miles per hour. With each feat, his confidence in his indestructibility grew. At night, Jason patrolled the streets as a nameless vigilante. He foiled late-night robberies, stopped drunken brawlers, rescued assault victims. News spread of an unidentified hero with unbelievable power. But Jason knew these minor acts were not enough to balance out the lives lost in the train wreck he inexplicably survived. And the encrypted data chip proved the company was still hiding the truth for profit, risking new tragedy. He had to do more. One evening after work, Jason studied himself in the mirror, psyching up for the next phase of his crusade. He had crafted a distinctive black and gray armored suit, lightweight and flexible, yet nearly indestructible like him. A mask hid his features in shadow. No more hiding in the shadows, Jason told his reflection. Tonight, the city sees its new sentinel, the Invincible shadow. Swinging and leaping across rooftops high above the streets, the shadow felt truly untouchable. He was a streaking blur as he traversed block after block, an ominous specter haunting the city's darkest corners. Soon enough, a cry rang out from a nearby alleyway. With incredible speed, the shadow rappelled down the side of a building and landed in a crouch before a group of thugs, their knives pressed against a cowering woman's neck. "Let her go," the shadow growled, his voice warped and deepened by a modulator. The thieves looked stunned for a moment before sneering confidently. "Or what, freak?" one jeered. "You're outnumbered 5-1. Before they could blink, the shadow had disarmed 2 thugs and knocked them unconscious. He grabbed a third goon and hurled him into a dumpster. The remaining criminals turned to flee, but the shadow snatched them easily and tied them together with a street lamp. "Who are you?" the woman stammered, shocked and grateful. "I'm the Invincible shadow," he announced, "and this city is now under my protection." News quickly spread of the mysterious dark hero who could lift cars and move faster than the eye could see. Dubbed the Invincible shadow by witnesses, he became a symbol of justice, a silent, unbreakable sentinel, watching over the city when law and order failed. Criminals feared him greatly, surrendering as soon as they saw his signature swirling cape. But to allies and innocents, the shadow was a ray of hope, striking from the darkness to defend those in need. Jason worked by day and patrolled as the shadow all night. He felt engrossed in purpose, making up for lost lives through vigilante justice. But he knew the train company was still hiding the truth and someday may cause a new disaster. He had to take drastic action. One midnight at the rail yard, the shadow perched atop a water tower overlooking the scene. Police tape still stretched uselessly across piles of incinerated wreckage. He took a deep breath and leapt down powerfully in the middle of the scrap heap. Immediately, alarms blared, spotlights flooding the area. Security guards rushed out but stopped dead in their tracks at the sight of the dark, imposing figure searching determinedly through the ruins. Finding what he needed, the train's thoroughly destroyed data box, the shadow turned to the trembling guards with a growl. Tell your bosses this cover-up ends today." And with that, he was gone. Later that night, a massive data leak rocked headlines. The encrypted chip's damning revelations published anonymously online for all to see. Officials had no choice but to investigate the company's long-hidden negligence. A message mysteriously appeared on the police chief's computer. "The truth is out. My work here is done, for now." It was signed simply Shadow. Standing atop a skyscraper, the Shadow surveyed the glittering city landscape as the sun peeked over the horizon. He felt a sense of pride and purpose now. His trauma had driven him to become a force for redemption, shedding light on injustice. For in the darkness, nothing was beyond his unbreakable grasp. During the day, Jason Carter lived an utterly mundane existence, working as an unassuming security guard at a corporate office downtown. He blended into the crowd of workers rushing through the lobby each morning, just another average guy getting through the daily grind. No one knew that when the sun went down, Jason became the Invincible Shadow, a powerful vigilante cloaked in secrecy and myth. His anonymous nighttime heroics were only whispered rumors to his oblivious co-workers. Leading this double life was equal parts thrilling and exhausting for Jason. As a security guard, he had to be affable but utterly forgettable, just part of the everyday background noise. At the front desk, Jason made small talk with the receptionist and greeted tenants he would later prowl the city streets, protecting as the Shadow. But here, he was just plain old regular Jason. As the workday ended, Jason clocked out and briskly walked to his hidden downtown apartment. No one could know this was his base of operations, the place he researched targets and planned that night's shadowy patrol. Closing the door behind him, Jason let his guard down for the first time since leaving home that morning. He splashed some water on his face and caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror. "Just get through the day," he told himself. "Come sunset, you can shed this mundane skin." Re-energized, Jason opened his closet containing the armored supersuit and gadgets of the Shadow. He meticulously donned each piece, transforming himself both mentally and physically. Gone was unassuming security guard Jason Carter. In his place stood the Invincible Shadow, unstoppable instrument of justice. As the sun sank below the skyline, the Shadow emerged from the apartment's hidden underground tunnel. He relished the freedom of somersaulting from rooftop to rooftop, patrolling from on high. Tonight's targets were a weapons smuggling outfit operating out of the docks. Perched on a crane, the Shadow used his enhanced vision to observe the gang unloading illegal shipments. He silently glided down, disappearing into the shadows. In an instant, he had disarmed half the criminals without being detected. But when one thug spotted the Shadow and opened fire, lightning reflexes took over. The Shadow ducked, rolled, and lunged, dismantling guns faster than his opponents could blink. After tying up the gang, he left an anonymous tip for police, then grappled up a tower to continue his covert patrol. As dawn approached, the Shadow returned home and descended into the hidden basement. Jason Carter emerged, peeling off the mask and armor of his alter ego until his next nightly mission. At work the next day, Jason overheard co-workers whispering about the Shadow's latest takedown. He hid his smile, keeping up the appearance of an average nobody. This was Jason's life now, slipping between identities, maintaining mundane normality by day and seeking justice by night. It was an exhausting balance. Part of Jason yearned to shed his dull security job and be the Shadow full-time. But he knew his nightly heroics depended on preserving his unsuspecting alter ego. So Jason continued existing as two people, the forgettable guard and the unforgettable vigilante. He found meaning in this twofold life, upholding justice when his city needed a guardian. No matter how tired he felt, putting on the sleek armored suit each night filled Jason with purpose. The Invincible Shadow was the embodiment of his trauma transmuted into power, the reason he had survived. During the depths of night, gliding over moonlit rooftops as the Shadow, Jason felt most fully himself, Here, he had discovered his true calling, to protect those who could not protect themselves. When the sun rose, Jason dutifully donned his uniform once more to complete the illusion. Coworkers exchanged pleasant small talk with the security guard, unaware he safeguarded them after hours as well. "Just make it to sunset," Jason repeated his daily mantra. He imagined the coming night where his two worlds would separate again. By day, he would walk through the world unseen and unnoticed. Then by night, strike fear in the hearts of evildoers as the invincible shadow, silent protector of the helpless and hopeless. During his days as a security guard, Jason Carter kept up a convincing facade of normalcy, betraying nothing of his shrouded alter ego. But internally, he struggled to reconcile his fractured identities. At night, empowered as the shadow, Jason felt strong, purposeful, as if this were his true self rising to the surface. Stalking the city's rooftops, he was decisive and bold, sharply focused on his mission. But when dawn broke, doubt began creeping in. Jason became withdrawn and pensive as he shed the mask and armor of the shadow, just an average guy once more. Was his heroic alter ego simply an escape from his mundane existence? Had trauma warped his mind, creating an imaginary outlet for repressed frustrations? At the office, Jason went through the motions on autopilot, smiling blankly and exchanging empty pleasantries. But his mind was always elsewhere, wrestling with existential questions. Who was his authentic self? The drab security guard or the dashing vigilante? Had the train crash created the shadow, or merely awakened what already lay dormant within? Seeking answers, Jason delved back into investigating the derailment, poring over the leaked data for insights. There had to be some clue about the accident's role in creating or revealing his alter ego. But the reports proved less illuminating than maddening. Page after page documented the company's callous negligence, yet nothing about the crash's inexplicable aftermath. Slamming his fist on his desk, Jason cursed the data for failing to validate the shadow's existence. He began to fear this fruitless search for answers was becoming an unhealthy obsession. That night on patrol, doubt invaded Jason's thoughts, distracting him from his work. A pair of bank robbers nearly escaped his grasp before he refocused his fractured mind and apprehended them. Back home, Jason sat on his couch, still wearing the mask of the shadow, struggling to silence the warring voices within. He now lived two lives, but felt anchorless, unmoored from any solid sense of self. Gazing at his reflection, Jason grappled with his fractured identity. Was he imagining this hero lurking beneath the surface, or truly unleashing his hidden potential? Did it even matter if it brought justice? Overwhelmed by uncertainty, Jason knew only that he must separate his two selves moving forward. By rigidly devoting days to guard duties and nights to shadow work, perhaps he could compartmentalize his fractured mind. Maintaining laser mental focus on whichever role he inhabited would be the only way to avoid being consumed by doubt. His destiny depended on keeping the line between selves sharply defined. The next morning, Jason recommitted to his unremarkable daytime facade with renewed discipline. He made banal chit-chat at the security desk without a flicker of his inner turmoil visible. But he eagerly anticipated nightfall, when he could embrace his truer nature. As the shadow, Jason was decisive and unburdened, liberated from the doubts plaguing his waking hours. In this way, Jason's bifurcated lifestyle settled into a sustainable balance. By firmly separating his two worlds, he discovered a way to function through rigidly defined purpose. Yet, try as he might to deny it, Jason knew a deeper integration of selves would eventually be needed to achieve wholeness. For now, compartmentalization would suffice to serve justice and keep debilitating conflict at bay. But the time would come to confront the psychological schism widening within his fractured soul. Only then could Jason Carter and the Invincible Shadow finally become one integrated being, at harmony with himself and his city. Before that revelation arrived, Jason took comfort in the knowledge that his fractured mind was, for now, focused toward righteousness. By day, an ordinary man upholding order. By night, an extraordinary hero dismantling injustice. This was Jason's life of duality, of fractured selves locked in coexistence. Whether birthed from trauma or hidden potential, the Shadow was here to stay, and with this gift came a responsibility to see his fractured self made whole. In the months since taking his crusade public as the Invincible Shadow, Jason had become a folk hero to the city's helpless and oppressed. Stories spread of the mysterious figure who could withstand point-blank gunfire and lift vehicles to rescue trapped civilians. To the downtrodden, the Shadow was a symbol of light fighting back the darkness that permeated the city's grimy underbelly. A luminary emerging in obscurity to raise up those forgotten and trampled beneath the boots of society's callousness. Where flashing police lights brought dread, the silhouette of the Shadow descending from above brought hope. His presence meant deliverance was near for victims of cruelty and greed. Under the anonymity of his sleek black mask, Jason was able to fully embrace his role as a champion of the oppressed. Free of mundane distractions, he focused entirely on dispensing justice and standing with the vulnerable. The Invincible Shadow knew no fear in confronting thugs, thieves, human traffickers, and murderers. Bullets bounced off his armored suit like rain as he dismantled weapons and liberated the enslaved. After rescuing 3 girls being trafficked across the border, the Shadow delivered them safely to a women's shelter downtown. The director broke down in tears at the sight of the city's invincible sentinel on her doorstep. "Bless you," she said, hugging the frightened girls close. "These children can now dream of a future because of you." Hearing such words reaffirmed Jason's conviction in his all-consuming mission. The Shadow was their champion, persevering through the darkness so they might walk in light. Over time, the Shadow's reputation grew to almost mythical status. Few had seen the figure's face beneath the mask, adding to the air of otherworldly power surrounding him. He moved with supernatural speed and agility, apprehending multiple assailants in the blink of an eye, and any bullets seeking vulnerable flesh found only unbreakable determination. Under the cover of night, the Shadow tore through the underworld ranks, bringing entire trafficking rings to their knees. Drug kingpins lost millions in shipments intercepted by the city's unrelenting sentinel. Some nights, Jason barely slept between dismantling organized crime enterprises piece by piece. He felt unstoppable, fueled by purpose and driven to give hope to the hopeless. The Invincible Shadow soon became the scourge of the notorious Holland Gang, notorious for leaving a trail of bodies in their pursuit of power. Their ill-gotten empire built on murder, drugs, and fear was prime for toppling. Through gathering intel and surveillance, Jason learned the Holland Gang would all be convening for a meeting at a downtown penthouse to plan expansion. This was the perfect chance to decapitate the organization in one strike. As the gang's lieutenants reveled into the night, completely unawares, the Shadow descended from an adjoining rooftop like a bird of prey. He crashed through a sunroof window, sending razor-sharp glass spraying. Before they could even grasp their guns, the Shadow had disarmed and incapacitated over a dozen of the city's most dangerous criminals. All that remained was the kingpin. The Shadow turned to find the Holland gang leader desperately clutching a briefcase. "I leave town forever. You get these codes," he bargained, hands shaking. "Your empire ends tonight," replied the Shadow. He knocked the kingpin unconscious and disappeared as police sirens approached. The next day's headlines declared the Holland gang dismantled. Officials had no explanation, only a note found on the penthouse floor. "The City of Light has broken through obscurity." It was signed with the silhouette of a shadow. While police still sought his true identity, to the people the Shadow was revered. His mythic aura only grew as more were saved from the darkness by the light of hope he brought. There was no evil or injustice, beyond the invincible shadow's grasp. He was a faceless crusader, known only by the symbol on his chest, a beacon guiding the lost out of obscurity and into the light. The invincible shadow perched on a rooftop overlooking the city, a dark sentinel keeping watch through the night. Below him sprawled a grim landscape of decay. Abandoned buildings, litter-strewn alleys, and figures slinking about in the shadows. This was the rotting underbelly of the city, a fetid abyss teeming with crime and human misery. For all the justice he had brought down upon the city's ruthless gangs and traffickers, there were always new threats arising from the darkness. To truly save this city, the shadow knew he must descend into its subterranean depths, rooting out evil at its foul source. Gravity suddenly seized him as the shadow leapt from the rooftop, plummeting dozens of stories towards the alley below. At the last moment, he fired a grappling hook that pulled him to a gentle landing. Now at ground level, he was enveloped by the shadows. Carefully, the shadow made his way through the dangerous labyrinth of narrow alleys and decaying tenements. Every sense was on high alert for any sign of criminal activity or encroaching danger. A distant scream pierced the cold night air. With lightning speed, the shadow bounded up a fire escape and bounded across several rooftops, before dropping down into a trash-strewn back alley. 3 thugs had cornered a homeless man in the recesses of the alley, amusing themselves by burning him with their cigarettes. Before they could react, the shadow seized 2 by the collars and hurled them headlong into a dumpster. The 3rd thug wisely fled into the darkness. "Thank you," the shaking homeless man stammered. The shadow placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder, then fired his grappling gun to once more ascend to the rooftops above. For hours, the shadow traversed across this bleak urban landscape, descending at a moment's notice whenever cries for help pierced the cold night air. A teen cornered by a knife-wielding predator, a strung-out woman being beaten by dealers. The shadow's mysterious presence brought deliverance from the abyss. As dawn approached, the shadow found himself on the outskirts of the city where abandoned factories and warehouses stood crumbling like monuments to industrial decline. His research indicated this area was a stronghold of Viper, the shadowy leader of the city's ultra-violent street gangs. Perched on a rusty water tower above, the shadow observed a heavily armed group emerge from a decrepit warehouse. Zooming in, he could make out Viper herself, a huge bald woman with flame tattoos covering her face. She barked orders, and the group dispersed into the early morning gloom on some dark mission. The shadow silently shadowed Viper's truck as it made its way deeper into the decaying sprawl. When they arrived at a barren lot near the waterfront, the shadow watched from the rusty gantry of a derelict crane as Viper's crew unloaded a cache of military-grade weapons. An illegal arms deal was going down. Swooping down fast as a diving hawk, the shadow unleashed a volley of smoke pellets, obscuring the area in a thick haze. Confusion descended into chaos as he quickly disarmed and disabled over a dozen gangsters before they could even see where he was attacking from. When the smoke cleared, Viper found herself alone, her entire crew incapacitated and stripped of weapons. The shadow stood 10 feet away, his features obscured in darkness. Viper roared in anger, ripping a submachine gun from the back of her truck and unloading on the shadow. The bullets pinged harmlessly off his bulletproof armor as he stalked toward her. Viper staggered back, her face twisted in fear and disbelief at the shadow's invulnerability. In desperation, she turned to flee, but the shadow seized her in an unbreakable grip. "Your reign of terror ends," the shadow spoke in a rough, eerie voice. "The shadows cannot protect you anymore." He knocked the massive gang leader unconscious with a single blow. As the police sirens approached, the shadow grappled upwards, disappearing onto the rooftops once more. He had descended fully into the city's abyss and emerged victorious. Though pockets of evil still festered in the urban decay below, hope now blossomed that all was not lost. Where darkness bloomed, so too could light. The Invincible Shadow's crusade against crime and corruption had become an epic saga of redemption written day and night across the city landscape. Each villain apprehended and innocent saved added a new redemptive verse to his mythology. In the light of dawn, security guard Jason Carter upheld order through the mundane routines of his unremarkable job. But with the setting sun came transformation, both physical and mental. Donning mask and armor, Jason shed all traces of ordinary humanity to fully embrace his role as the Shadow. Leaping into the urban abyss with no hesitation, the Shadow faced every peril as a chance for righting past wrongs. On the decaying piers lining the river, the Shadow descended upon a notorious drug smuggling operation run by a merciless cartel. Dodging bullets, he swiftly disarmed the heavily armed thugs before sinking their contraband into the murky depths. Later, screams drew the Shadow to a crumbling tenement building. Bursting into a squalid apartment, he rescued a frail elderly man being beaten by his own son seeking drug money. The Shadow delivered the bruised victim to a nearby hospital, leaving the addicted son tied up for police. These acts of savagery witnessed ignited the Shadow's determination to eradicate the city's monstrous villains who preyed upon the helpless. The innocents, trampled each night, demanded ever more redemptive verses be written. The Shadow's mythic exploits continued in a darkened alley, where a teen gang initiation was underway. The inductees surrounded a frightened kid, knives glinting in the pale streetlight. But their ritual was interrupted by a chilling voice from above. "Only cowards find power through inflicting pain," the Shadow intoned, as the gang gazed up in shock. A blur of movement was their only warning before they found themselves disarmed and hogtied. The rescued boy looked skyward, crying grateful tears, but his deliverer had vanished. Later, racing across town, the Shadow arrived at a parking structure engulfed in flames. Screams echoed from within. Defying scorching heat, he tore metal beams aside and carried a terrified family from the inferno moments before it collapsed in flaming ruins. Back on patrol shortly after, the Shadow spotted a drunk driver careening down rain-slick streets. Moving quickly, he managed to rip open the car door at an intersection and pull the man to safety seconds before he crashed into a storefront. The Shadow's legend grew with each new verse. While those rescued rarely saw more than a fleeting glimpse of their rescuer, they took hope in knowing someone tireless watched over the city. With enhanced senses, the Shadow observed a world of suffering hidden in shadowy corners. The forsaken souls needing redemption most. His sight pierced the city's lingering darkness, revealing the forgotten. The Shadow's mythic exploits even inspired ordinary citizens to take redemptive action themselves. Seeing his selfless crusade, they could not ignore the injustice plaguing their communities. One night, the Shadow responded to a blaze and saved a single mother and daughter trapped on the 4th floor of a crumbling apartment building. Days later, residents who long ignored safety concerns now pushed the negligent landlord for overdue repairs and fire alarms. The Shadow's redemptive path through the streets became a beacon calling people to morally awaken and take action. He forged light from the depths of darkness. For Jason Carter, the Shadow was more than an alter ego. Donning mask and armor allowed his true heroic nature to fully emerge in pursuit of redemption. The Shadow let Jason become his best self, the man capable of writing righteousness into the city's difficult story. During the day, glimpses of his redemptive quest flashed through Jason's thoughts. Memories of rescues and battles last night fueled his unwavering dedication. Serving justice fortified his spirit. Come nightfall, Jason readily sacrificed any semblance of a normal life to transform into the Shadow. Leaving mundane concerns behind, he patrolled with monastic devotion, responding whenever innocence cried out from the depths. Each peril faced and noble deed done penned a new redemptive verse. These pages lifted the Shadow's mythology to inspire the city amidst gathering storms of corruption and cruelty. A sentinel safeguarding innocence, he wrote redemption through action. Jason had come to accept the train derailment that granted his powers as a tragic mystery of the past. But on an aimless walk downtown one morning, a serendipitous glimpse through a restaurant window changed everything. Sitting together at a back table was Stephen Elliott, the train company's regional vice president, locked in hushed conversation with a man Jason recognized as a notorious local mob boss. Their secrecy piqued Jason's curiosity. Discreetly snapping photos through the window, Jason decided to investigate this suspicious meeting. That night in the shadows, accessing the restaurant's security footage as the Shadow, he observed Elliott hand the mobster a suitcase, presumably filled with cash. The next day, Jason placed a tracking device on Elliott's luxury sedan. For weeks, through diligent surveillance, he slowly connected the dots. Elliott was paying off the mafia to sabotage company trains and facilities. But why would a high-ranking train executive conspire to orchestrate derailments and damage his own trains? Then it dawned on Jason: insurance payouts. With each accident, Elliott collected big insurance claims while boosting company profits rebuilding damaged infrastructure. Shaken, Jason realized the derailment that granted his powers may not have been an isolated incident of corporate negligence. It seemed more likely Elliott had the mob orchestrate Jason's train wreck for his own financial gain. Those deaths were no accident. They were murder. Jason recalled his early investigations had only pinned blame on the company in general, but Elliott had masterminded it all, specifically for his self-enrichment. Jason now knew the target deserving of the Shadow's justice. Under the cover of night, the Shadow accosted Elliott outside his penthouse. Though afraid, Elliott arrogantly defended his actions. "A few lost lives is acceptable business for the substantial payouts I've brought this company," he sneered. Repulsed, the Shadow knocked Elliott unconscious and left him bound on the steps of the police department, along with irrefutable evidence of his deadly schemes. With Elliott's arrest, Jason hoped to finally find closure, but late one night he awoke to strange noises downstairs. The sound of multiple intruders. Donning his shadow gear, Jason descended the stairs to confront the invaders. A eerie sight awaited in the living room. Surrounding Jason's mentor and father figure, Abraham, were over a dozen armed mobsters. Their guns turned menacingly toward Jason. The lead mobster spoke. "Here's the deal, Shadow. You took one of ours, we take one of yours. Drop the crusade or the old man dies." Jason stood stunned, his mind racing. "Don't worry about me, Jason," Abraham shouted defiantly. Jason froze in shock at the sound of his real name, spoken in this condemned man's last moments. With no options left, Jason made the only choice he could to save Abraham's life, lowering his defenses and tossing aside his weapons in surrender. The mobsters converged on Jason and shoved a black sack over his head. Blinded, Jason heard the sound of a gunshot ring out, followed by Abraham's body slumping to the floor. Jason cried out in anguish beneath the sack, his heart shattering with grief and rage. The mobsters dragged Jason roughly to a waiting van. As they drove off, Jason cursed himself for not realizing how ruthless these killers were. His hesitation had cost an innocent life, forced him to make a crestfallen sacrifice. Stripped of his powers and consumed with grief over Abraham's death, Jason saw only darkness ahead. The Shadow had failed his mission, and now evil had free reign once more over the city he had sworn to protect. Blindfolded and bound, Jason was dragged from the van into a damp, chilly basement. The sack was ripped from his head, and he found himself looking into the smug faces of over a dozen mobsters. Behind them, Stephen Elliott sat calmly with a satisfied grin. "Not so tough now, are you, Shadow?" Elliott sneered. You should have left well enough alone. My operations were keeping this city and its worthless riffraff in line. Jason strained against his chains, fury rising in him. You murdered innocent people. For money! I'm bringing your whole rotten criminal empire down. Elliot laughed. You're not bringing anything down anymore. The only way you're getting out of here is in a body bag. He nodded to his thugs, who began landing furious blows to Jason's stomach and face. Coughing blood, pain shooting through him, Jason slumped in his chains. But he focused his mind and forced his body to turn impervious. The mobster's punches soon began to break their own hands against his invincible flesh. What the? Elliot jumped up in shock. Regaining his composure, he grabbed a lead pipe and bashed Jason across the head, to no effect. Gripped by fear and rage, he motioned for his goons to open fire. The basement echoed with gunshots as Jason stood unflinching, bullets ricocheting harmlessly off his body. Elliot fled up the stairs in terror. With a mighty heave, Jason broke free of the chains binding him and incapacitated the remaining mobsters. Bursting onto the street, Jason saw Elliot peeling away in his sedan. He sprinted after the car, reaching impossible speeds on foot. Catching up, Jason launched himself through the passenger window in a shower of glass. A brief scuffle ended with Jason knocking Elliot out cold. He dumped the crooked executive on the police station steps, along with irrefutable evidence tying him to the train derailments. Days later, the headlines declared Elliot's conviction on murder charges. But Jason took no joy in this victory. Back in his empty apartment, anguished memories of Abraham's murder flooded his mind. Jason knew threats and dangers still lurked in every corner of the city. Mobsters seeking revenge, new criminals arising from the shadows. But bitterness and doubt crippled him. For weeks, the invincible shadow was nowhere to be seen prowling the rooftops. Underworld figures grew bold, no longer fearing retribution from the dark sentinel who once instilled terror. Crime rates began to climb. One desperate night, a battered woman carried her crying son to the police station. Through tears, she told of being robbed and assaulted, with no one intervening. Please, she implored officers, where is the shadow? From the darkness, Jason observed this heartbreaking scene. The woman's desperate plea pierced through his numbness and reignited his spirit. She needed the shadow. The city needed him. Jason realized he had been foolish to ever consider abandoning his righteous crusade, whatever the dangers that lay ahead. The shadow was his destiny, his solemn duty until his last breath. Donning his armored mask once more, the shadow took to the city landscape reborn, fierce and fearless. Criminals who had reveled in his absence now cowered as he brought street justice down upon them without mercy. Over the following weeks, the shadow dismantled drug rings, intercepted illegal weapon shipments, and busted every manner of thugs and killers. Hope surged anew among citizens who knew their dark guardian had returned. With relentless determination, the shadow continued to safeguard innocence and punish evildoers. Though the mob still conspired against him, their most diabolical traps could not contain his indomitable spirit. Exhausted and battered by his crusade, Jason endured through sheer force of will. The promise of dawn kept him going, the promise of a city no longer living in fear and shadow. Where darkness spread, he would be light. No matter the adversity, Jason knew he would never back down until justice prevailed. The invincible shadow would stand steadfast, whatever the cost. His was a path of struggle, but one walked with purpose true. So night after night, through blood and bruise, the shadow fought on. A silent force of righteous retribution, undeterred by pain or peril. His resolute crusade diminished evil's grip, keeping hope's flame burning as redemption's dawn crept slowly closer. The mystery of Jason's inexplicable powers still gnawed at him, even after bringing Stephen Elliott to justice. Though he had uncovered the corporate negligence behind the train wreck, deeper questions remained unanswered. How did he alone emerge unscathed from total destruction? What was the origin of his miraculous invincibility? And what did destiny have in store for him now? Seeking closure, Jason arranged a final meeting with Dr. Abraham, his mentor, at the quiet diner where they often conversed over coffee. He hoped Abraham could provide wisdom and insight to unravel the enigmas that still shrouded his trauma. "My boy, you have been given a great gift," Abraham said gently as Jason voiced his lingering doubts. "But gifts bring responsibilities. Your life is forever changed. You now walk a hero's path." Jason shook his head bitterly. "I'm no hero. I failed you. Let you die at the hands of those murderers." His fist clenched at the painful memory. Abraham placed a reassuring hand over Jason's. "You carry blame that does not belong to you. My fate was sealed, but yours is just unfolding. Do not waste this chance dwelling on the past." Abraham's calm wisdom pierced Jason's bitterness, but uncertainty still plagued him. "I still don't understand where this power comes from, or what I'm meant to do with it." "The answers you seek lie within yourself," Abraham replied sagely. "You need only quiet your mind and listen." That night, alone in his apartment, Jason settled onto his meditation mat to reflect on Abraham's counsel. He closed his eyes, focusing on his breath and slowly emptying his mind. As he centered his awareness inward, Jason suddenly felt enveloped by a warm energy pulsing through his body. The living room faded away, and time seemed to stop. Vivid images flashed before his mind's eye. He saw himself as a young boy, even after terrible accidents, constantly emerging unhurt. Himself developing uncanny speed and strength in adolescence, far beyond his peers. A latent power had been building within his whole life, waiting to be awakened. The visions shifted, and Jason saw glimpses of a glowing figure visiting his cribside as an infant, imparting a gentle blessing upon him. He sensed this was no ordinary human, but a being of great power and light who had chosen Jason for a divine purpose. As the meditative visions faded, Jason opened his eyes with a start, feeling goosebumps rising on his skin. Finally, he understood. His gifts were no accident, but had been granted at birth by some benevolent force beyond comprehension. He had a destiny to fulfill. Over the following weeks, Jason's powers seemed to grow even stronger, as if fully activated by the revelations of his meditation. He felt more in control of his abilities and increasingly tapped into the well of energy pulsing within. Though many questions remained, Jason no longer doubted his purpose had a higher meaning. He was not just Jason Carter, but had become the Invincible Shadow, a paragon of light against the darkness, on a providential path to serve justice and protect the innocent. As the Shadow, Jason sensed his perceptions heightening. He could see in infrared, perceive radio waves, and hear cries for help miles away. His reflexes heightened to superhuman levels. His strength knew no bounds. His skin could not be pierced. Jason's miraculous origin empowered him to fight on, even when exhaustion and injury might stop other heroes. Because he knew this was not merely his crusade, but a divine mission greater than himself. The city's criminals soon learned their tactics were fruitless against a man impervious to harm. The shadows held no more refuge for evildoers, as the Shadow shone his light into every crevice of corruption. Though questions still loomed, the genesis of Jason's gifts was laid bare, revealed as a blessing, not a curse. By lifting the veil on his trauma, Jason saw his purpose clearly illuminated before him at last. Empowered by revelations beyond himself, the Invincible Shadow would continue his redemptive quest tirelessly. With an unyielding spirit and strength beyond measure, he walked boldly into his destiny as a paragon of hope against the darkness. After years protecting the city as the Invincible Shadow, Jason had come to see himself as a lone warrior, battling evil and injustice. But one earth-shattering revelation would force him to question everything. Through relentless investigation, the Shadow obtained classified memos detailing a sprawling government conspiracy, one stretching to the highest levels of power. The derailment that gave Jason his abilities was no accident, but a clandestine experiment in genetic engineering gone awry. The government had conspired with the train company to create human super soldiers capable of withstanding catastrophic injuries, but the experiments resulted in unthinkable tragedy. The train crash that granted Jason powers while killing dozens of innocent civilians. Jason reeled as the horrific truth crystallized. The accident that had scarred him was manufactured by the very system he served as the Shadow. He was just a pawn of corrupt forces, looking to breed living weapons through lethal schemes. Sitting alone in his darkened apartment, waves of anger, guilt, and confusion washed over Jason. How could he continue his crusade when it was born from such sinister machinations? Was everything he thought noble about himself now a monstrous lie? Donning his armored disguise, Jason confronted the police commissioner, his longtime ally, with the incriminating evidence. To his dismay, the commissioner calmly defended the necessary sacrifices made to advance national security interests. Jason realized with chilling clarity that the police, government officials, and train company were all entangled in the same sprawling web of murderous deceit. There were no untarnished heroes left, only oppressors and the oppressed. That night, the Shadow burst into train company headquarters to face the executives responsible for the slaughter that created him. But his trusted friend Alicia stood defiantly among them, siding with her bosses against Jason's accusations. "You're delusional," Alicia said coldly. "We run an honest business here. Take your twisted conspiracy theories elsewhere." Seeing Alicia defend the orchestrators of mass murder ignited a righteous fury in Jason. He wanted to force her to see the truth, to make all those complicit repent for their sins. But as Jason raised a fist to smash the CEO's desk, he froze. The ones he wanted to punish were no different than himself. All were trapped in shadowy systems larger than any individual. More violence would only add darkness to darkness. Lowering his fist, Jason removed his mask and looked Alicia in the eye. "The path I walk holds more shadows than light," he said heavily, and turned to leave. His allegiance to corrupt institutions was now severed. He would oppose evil, but through seeking justice, not vengeance. In the difficult days that followed, the Shadow had to stop crimes without relying on the compromised police force or government. But he took heart seeing citizens band together against injustice where officials failed them. "We no longer need a hero on high saving us," a community organizer told Jason one night. "By working together, we can be heroes for each other." Abuses Jason once fought alone now met resistance from newly vocal crowds marching through the streets for change. Their numbers and resolve outweighed any force brought to stop them. True justice, Jason realized, arose not from individuals, but communities uniting for the rights of all. Real heroes walked among the people, not above them. He joined the protests swelling throughout the city, one voice among many calling for a more just world. Through time, Jason learned to stop viewing the city as divided between light and darkness. The true battle was between justice and injustice, a battle fought not by solitary heroes, but by ordinary people choosing to stand together, even in the face of darkness. On nights when despair crept in, Jason recalled his miraculous origins, the vision of a divine figure blessing him with gifts to serve others. He still drifted back to that moment when doubt clouded his path. By remembering the light shining within him, Jason found the strength to keep fighting alongside others for a better world. Though the road ahead promised struggle, he walked it boldly, guided by the truth that had lifted shadows from his eyes. No longer a lone warrior, Jason saw rays of hope in the people united against corruption and greed to demand justice. And in their light, the shadows retreated. The revelation that the government and train company engineered the derailment that gave him powers left Jason disillusioned. Though gifted abilities beyond imagining, he now saw himself as an unknowing pawn in their lethal conspiracies rather than a hero. Severing all ties, Jason went underground. He shed the masked identity of the Shadow, becoming simply Jason Carter once more. But he could not idly stand by with the knowledge of the tyrannous forces imposing their will on the city from the shadows. Adopting the alias Citizen, Jason began working covertly to organize everyday people whose lives were disrupted by the sprawling corporate and governmental abuses of power. He published clandestine newsletters and spread grassroots resistance networks throughout neighborhoods. At first just a ragtag band of workers, families, and community advocates, Citizens slowly united them into a movement standing defiantly against oppression. They organized protests which police tried fruitlessly to quell, and strikes which brought greedy corporations reluctantly to the bargaining table. These ordinary yet fed-up people finally had a voice. With Citizens' guidance, their numbers and zeal continued swelling. The city's elite found their exploited underclass was now a force to be reckoned with. As the resistance gained momentum, intelligence reported that those in power were taking drastic steps to preserve their rule. An ultra-secret military unit, codenamed Hammer, was tasked with destroying the populist uprising by any means necessary. Citizen sources in the government leaked documents revealing Hammer's plans for mass surveillance, infiltration of resistance cells, and the capture of uprising leaders. They were essentially waging war against their own citizens. Having abandoned his role as the city's protector, Jason grappled with feelings of guilt over the government's repressive turn. He knew the populace needed the Shadow now more than ever as they faced this looming tyranny. Could he reawaken the person who once stood as a sentinel against the oppressors? Was there still room in his heart for redemption? The answers eluded Jason as the storm clouds gathered. Lives hung in the balance. That night, Jason stood alone on a rooftop overlooking the restless city. His role now was to guide the people's resistance, not to fight their battles. But he heard the voice within asking what one more selfless act could hurt. Donning the mask and armor of his former identity, Jason leapt from the rooftop into the darkness. The Shadow was back, if only fleetingly, to shield innocents as the full might of Hammer descended upon them. In the following weeks, the Shadow appeared without warning to thwart the military unit's efforts against protesters and resistance members. He destroyed surveillance devices, exposed undercover operatives, and led Hammer commandos on fruitless chases through the city's obscured back alleys and sewer tunnels. These acts of defiance gave Citizens' uprising precious time and space to flourish despite the government's crackdown. With the darkness held at bay by the Shadow's return, their vision of a just world ignited the people's hearts and minds. The Shadow had shaken off despair and self-doubt to stand with the vulnerable once more, though Citizen could never again fully embrace that identity, for now he channeled its power to turn the tide against injustice. But even the Shadow could not forestall the midnight hour indefinitely. One cold, fateful night, a Hammer strike team surrounded Jason on a tenement rooftop just as he shed mask and armor to make his escape. A familiar voice called out through a megaphone. The police commissioner. "It's over, Citizen," he said with grim resolution. "Your sedition ends now." Armored vans streamed into the streets below as squads broke down doors to round up resistance members. Jason closed his eyes, savoring one last moment of freedom before the inevitable. Though Hammer imprisoned thousands, the resistance endured, underground and under new leadership. They would not yield, knowing the hope Citizen sparked could never be jailed or destroyed. Light had awakened in their hearts, driving out fear. The authorities labeled Jason a terrorist threat, never understanding the truths he fought for were justice, equality, and freedom. But confined in his stark cell, Jason felt the stirrings of peace and contentment for the first time since his quest began. His burdens were passed on. The people were awakened. There would be no turning back. Jason languished in a windowless cell, his heroic alter ego of the Shadow now a fading memory. Though he had lit a spark of resistance, the people were leaderless as government oppression descended ever darker. Some nights Jason dreamed his cell door opened to reveal the police commissioner gloating, his body engulfed in writhing shadows. "Your hope dies tonight," the figure sneered. "All will yield to the darkness." But one moonless night, the cell door actually did grind open. There stood a silhouetted figure. It was Tara, the commissioner's daughter. "Hurry, this is our only chance," she urged. Jason hesitated. "This is a trick. You're one of them." "Not anymore," Tara said. "My father's gone mad with power, but many of us want to restore justice." She tossed Jason his shadow armor and mask. "Tonight we make our stand." Donning his disguise, Jason followed Tara through a maze of corridors and onto the facility's roof. Far below, an armored vehicle lay smashed. Tara's allies had stormed the impenetrable prison. Tara turned to Jason. "The commissioner is making his final move against the resistance. We need the Shadow." Jason fastened his mask and leapt from the rooftop, exhilarated to unleash his powers once more. He would rejoin the fight this night. The Shadow had returned. Tara's coordinates led the Shadow to a concentration camp on the city outskirts, holding captive resistance members. High electrified fences and guard towers surrounded row after row of barracks lit starkly by floodlights. From a wooded hilltop, the Shadow used his enhanced vision to scan the camp. Inside the barracks, thousands lived in horrible squalor, beaten and starved into submission. Men, women, and children, all deemed enemies of order by the commissioner. They would not last long in these brutal conditions, and the Shadow spotted armored transports unloading fresh prisoners into the camp under heavy guard. He had to act swiftly. Vowing to liberate everyone there, the Shadow streaked down the hill. In a blur, he tore through the perimeter fence and disarmed the shock guards. As alarms raised the alert, the Shadow became a whirlwind, knocking out guard posts and demolishing spotlights. Prisoners poured from the barracks as their hero ripped doors from hinges. "You're free," he told them. "Head for the forest." The surging crowd faltered when armed guards blocked the exit, tanks rumbling ahead. They were completely trapped, with nowhere to run. "Hold together and stay behind me," the Shadow yelled. Steeling himself, he marched alone toward the massed forces, bristling with weapons. The guards opened fire, bullets sparking harmlessly off the Shadow's chest. Herding the prisoners into the shelter of the barracks, the Shadow led the armored column away in a chaotic chase through the camp. When he reached a tank depot, he ripped up a fuel tank and tipped it onto the tanks, detonating the entire stockpile in a thunderous fireball that lit the sky for miles. As reinforcements closed in, the Shadow knew he had only one option left to save the prisoners, an all-out assault on the control tower commanding the entire camp. He had to take out the commissioner personally. Bursting into the command center, the Shadow confronted his nemesis one-on-one for the first time since being captured. "Your rule by fear ends tonight," he declared. The commissioner's body suddenly transformed, exuding darkness like a black hole devouring all light. He had become the very embodiment of corruption. "You cannot stop what is coming," the mutated figure intoned. The two collided, crashing through concrete walls in cataclysmic combat. The commissioner was now more powerful than ever, fueled by pure malice from some evil source. He pummeled the Shadow mercilessly. Staggering to his feet with blood dripping from his mouth, the Shadow knew he had only one chance left. Summoning every ounce of power gifted to him long ago, he let loose a thunderous blow straight to the commissioner's chest, cracking the black armor encasing it. A deafening roar shook the complex as blinding light exploded from deep within the commissioner's dark shell. Cracks spread across his entire form before he burst apart like shattering onyx, raining shards over the ruined command tower. Beneath the fading veil of darkness, the shadow saw the man the commissioner had once been. A noble public servant, now mourning all the evil committed under the guise of authority. Forgiveness shone in his eyes. Then he was gone. As the first rays of dawn rose, the shadow led the weary prisoners out of bondage into the forest. "Farewell, shadow," an old man said. "Your light will shine forever in our hearts." They had reached sanctuary at last after the long dark night. Trudging alone up a wooded trail as morning mist filled the valley, Jason was suddenly overcome by the enormity of all that had happened. He collapsed to his knees and wept. The light had prevailed over the darkness. Sensing his presence was no longer needed, Jason surrendered to a profound exhaustion unlike any he had known. A divine peace settled upon him as he lay down in a bed of wildflowers. The unyielding dawn had come at last. In the weeks after the climactic battle, Jason retreated from the city to process all that had transpired. Though he found solace wandering the tranquil forests, he knew a return to society loomed. But to what end? His heroic alter ego, the Shadow, had become a legend after defeating the Commissioner, but the mythic persona felt distanced from Jason's true self now. Donning the mask and armor served its purpose for a time, yet ultimately divided his fractured psyche even further. Jason realized that playing dual roles, the unremarkable security guard versus the bold crusader, took immense effort to maintain. The strain of living two separate existences in opposition had brought him to the brink. If he returned to the city, could Jason reconcile his identities into one integrated whole? Was society ready to accept not an unknowable myth, but just a man trying to do good? Unsure if redemption was possible, Jason wandered on alone through the tranquil wilderness. One crystalline morning, Jason awoke before sunrise beneath a stand of trees. He watched the emerging dawn gradually illuminate the landscape and felt its radiance fill his soul. Jason knew at last the time had come to leave old identities behind. No longer the Shadow, nor the security guard. He would return to society as his true self, faults and all, with a mission to better the lives of others. As Siddir, shedding his doubts along with the last vestiges of his alter ego's disguise, Jason followed the rising sun toward the city. He felt the lightness of a man unburdened by expectations and free to walk his own path without regrets. This was his new beginning. Re-entering the now peaceful city, Jason was surprised to find that people remembered him not as the Shadow, but simply as someone who stood up when hope seemed lost. They cared not about myths or masks, just the message he helped ignite in their hearts. Jason befriended those working to rebuild communities shattered by greed and corruption. His unique gifts could hasten progress where work was most needed. At a rundown school, Jason toiled tirelessly doing repairs beyond the means of handymen. His tireless efforts inspired volunteers to flock there each weekend, donating tools, supplies, and elbow grease. When he spied an elderly woman struggling under the weight of her groceries, Jason rushed to lift her burden with one hand and walk her safely home. "Thank you, dear," she said with relief. "It's nice to see a friendly face around here." At a homeless shelter, Jason provided staple food items in bulk by pulling a small trailer of goods from donors happy to give excess crops and baked goods. The simple kindness was received with more gratitude than his heroics ever were. As word spread, Jason found himself inundated with requests for help, big and small. He took time to listen to each person's story and determine how to best serve them with his abilities. Eager to uplift others, his own trials seemed to grow lighter. Once accustomed to the city's shadows, Jason walked freely in the light, interacting with people as one human to another. He found purpose not in secretive exploits, but small daily acts of compassion and charity that rippled outward. Still, Jason took care not to let fame distract him from his humble mission. He turned down talk show offers and avoided the media spotlight. Pride and ego had no place in this work. Each night he graciously thanked Providence for the chance to change lives through simple decency. When Jason encountered those still struggling with poverty and misfortune, he vowed to continue serving until all had the chance to shape their own destinies through hard work and community strength. On the anniversary of the fateful train derailment that altered Jason's path, he returned to the rebuilt station. That accident had felt like an end, but became a beginning. From tragedy arose renewal and newfound purpose. Riding the 9:15 commuter train home, Jason gazed out at the city lights whizzing past and imagined the good deeds happening at that very moment all throughout the landscape. Neighbors helping neighbors, unity conquering division. Jason had been many personas over the years, victim, hero, legend, but now embraced just being himself in service to others. For in a city shared, everyone's light illuminated the whole. The invincible shadows myth would endure wherever innocence suffered or injustice lurked. But Jason had moved beyond myth into the light of truth, that even one ordinary person empowered by hope could change the world.
Thank you very much for listening. Please leave a like if you enjoyed this story. Subscribe if you loved it.